Welcome everyone to another episode 8 of Content for Devs. Today we are talking with Jeremy Evans. He's the creator of the Rhoda framework. He's the maintainer of SQL and some other um, Ruby libraries that we all use. So we'll be asking him a couple of questions and letting him tell us about his life. Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, same. How are you, Seb?
I'm super excited. I'm super excited. Like I waited for years to make this interview, so no
Yeah.
pressure, no stress, no pressure.
Okay, what do you
um,
say if we jump right into questions?
Yeah.
Okay, could you tell us a little bit about the about Roda, its history, how it came out to be?
So Rhoda came out. I was originally a Rails developer. I've been a Rails developer for a few years, and then I discovered Sinatra. This was in like 2008 or so. And I really liked how Sinatra made web development much more simple than Rails. So for a few years, I'd say about until about 2014, I was pretty heavily using Sinatra for most of my web development. Um, in 2014, I discovered Cuba, which is similar kind of to Sinatra, but it uses this nested way to break down routes. And I found it actually to eliminate a lot of the duplication that sort of comes from your Sinatra routes, because in Sinatra, all of your routes are independent. So you don't have there's like hard it's harder to share behavior between routes. It's not as simple to do so when you have with Cuba's approach. Basically, it's much more easy to share behavior between routes. So, like very common in my applications, I'll have a get route and a post route for the same thing. A lot of the initial setup will be the same. I mean, the same access control, same retrieving the initial object from the database, that sort of thing. So in the Sinatra routes, it'd be like duplicated code in the top of both of these routes to do the same setup. Whereas in Cuba's approach, you could have it once at the top, and then for the get handler, only the stuff specific to get goes there, and for the post handler, only the stuff specific to post goes there. So I liked that part of Cuba, but it was less user friendly than Sinatra. I originally wanted to work with the Cuba devs and say, hey, I think these are improvements that we could make. Are you open to them? And they weren't. So I ended up forking Cuba and making it more like Sinatra. So that's sort of how Rhoda was born. It's sort of a combination of Cuba and Sinatra, trying to take the best elements of both. Um, One of the big changes that I wanted to make was that Sinatra has is that the route blocks, the return value of the blocks, is the body of the response. So that was one of the huge things that Sinatra made web development easier for. That's what I wanted to use, and that you can't do that with Cuba. Cuba sort of wants you to be explicit and manually write all of your responses, which I guess is a very explicit approach. Not really. I wasn't really a big fan of that. The other thing I thought Cuba could benefit from was a plugin system, because Cuba in general is very small, but it's harder in Cuba to do bigger things because the framework's so small. You have to add everything yourself, and then there's that's one of the things people also say about Sinatra is like, well, if you use Sinatra instead of Rails, you end up having to rebuild most of Rails, and that's it's not fully true, but there is some truth in that. So the idea with Rhoda is it's as small as Cuba, pretty much, but it comes with a plugin system, and it ships with a whole bunch of plugins that you can add that are fully supported, that add a lot of the features that if you need them, you can use them. So Rhoda ships with over like 100 plugins for things that are sort of included by a lot of them are included by default in Rails, but if you don't use them, then why pay the cost for loading them? So that's one of the big ideas with Rhoda is it's a plugin based framework where you only pay for what you use, and there's tons and tons of different plugins it ships with, and there's external plugins. Um, Now that one of the advantages of this is that it ends up being not just because of this, but for other reasons as well. Rhoda is extremely fast. That's one of the big advantages of it. My personal advantage, I don't really I, the applications I work on are not performance intensive. I mean, there's not really a need for them to be super fast. My huge benefit for me using Rhoda is this, the fact that it allows you to share behavior between routes more easily, which ends up resulting in code that is significantly easier to read and understand and modify. That's one of the huge benefits to me, is that you don't have this redundancy all over the place, where if you want to make a change, you can make a change in bunch of places. You can make a change in one place and have it affect like a whole bunch of routes. That's one of the big advantages to me. And one of the advantages over Rails is that you can sort of do what Rhoda does with before filters in Rails and in Sinatra. But if you ever use Rails and you have a lot of before filters, it ends up being code that's not easy to understand. Whereas with Rhoda, it's much easier to understand Rhoda code, because you can just read it from the top to the bottom and see exactly what's going on. There's very little hidden logic that you have to sort of deal with when you're dealing with Rails. So that's one of my main advantages of using it. Seb?
Yeah, I have a question. In your talks and presentations, you often highlight how performant Ruda is and how it compares with other frameworks, Ruby frameworks especially. And there are a lot of caveats, like rumors that Rise is not performant enough. There are like performance issues, that Ruby is slow, and so on. And I have a feeling that if all frameworks would apply Rhoda solutions to be performant, a lot of these discussions would never happen. And my question is, why do you think, in your opinion, why do you think Rhoda is so fast comparing to other Ruby frameworks? Because it's open source and other people can just copy it, right? Copy the solutions, at least, or ideas. Why people do not do it?
Well, one of the reasons Roto is fast, I'd say the primary reason, especially for smaller apps, like, people tend to benchmark like Hello World apps, which are not really indicative of real world performance. One of the reasons Roto is fast there is it tries to minimize the amount of code that it's running as much as possible. I mean, it really, the way Roto works, and especially for like a Hello World app, it's almost exactly like when you pass it, the rack environment. Um, does very, very little. There's very, very little setup. It's like three objects instantiates, and then it yields to the routing block. So there's very, very low little code that it's actually running to do that. The way it works well for certainly more complex applications. One of the benchmarks I commonly run with Rode and other frameworks is one I wrote called R10K, which is a benchmark of how web frameworks can scale in terms of the number of routes. So it tests at 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 routes in a nested format, and it allows you to see sort of, as you have more routes to an application, what happens in terms of the web framework's performance. And Rhoda does very well for this. Rails does fairly well too. Rails starts out slow, but doesn't get significantly slower if you add tons of routes to it. I mean, Rails router I think is called Journey. It's in some ways it's something much more complex than Rhoda's approach. For some things it's better, for some things it's worse, but it's pretty good in terms of, you add tons of routes, it does fine. So Rails router is good in that regard. It's just Rails itself has extremely high overhead, so it appears slow no matter when you benchmark it, no matter how many routes it has, simply because there's so much overhead that Rails does for every request. Rhoda avoids that for the most part. Uh, if you add a lot of plugins to Rhoda, you can sort of get there, but it's still, even if you add tons of plugins to Rhoda, it's still generally much faster than Rails. But the main reason it's faster, again, is doing less work, fewer allocations, more direct code paths, that sort of thing. That's the basic thing. As you add features, your application is going to get slower unless you make those features optional via like a plugin type framework, like what Rhoda does. So Rhoda starts out very fast, and then it only gets slower if you add features that would require it to be slower to work. That's really the design principle.
I was gonna ask
Awesome,
about
thanks.
the arts and K, but you answered all my questions in one sentence. That's
That's
awesome.
good.
I have more questions. One is
That's great.
definitely about your motivations. Despite just writing own framework, which is pretty cool, however hard it needs to be, um, you are also like wrote a book and you do whole lot of performance. I mean, presentations, interviews like this one, and this all of that takes a lot of time. And what motivates you to do that? What is the reason behind that?
So, in terms of the libraries that I work on, the open source Ruby libraries that I work on, my main motivation is that it helps me at my job. I mean, my job is not just to work on open source. It's not really work at open source at all. It's just that at my job, I work for a small government agency. Pretty much all of our applications are written in the frameworks and libraries that I maintain: SQL, Rhoda, Rodoth, Form A. Those are, I mean, all of the web applications that we run are basically written in those libraries. So there's a primary motivation. A lot of the features I've added is stuff I need myself in my own applications. And one of the advantages of doing that is it allows me to see how things actually work. One of the big problems if you're just writing a framework and you don't have any experience using the framework, you don't really know the pain points of the framework. Whereas in what I'm working on, I'm constantly using the frameworks and libraries I'm using, I'm writing, so I can see where the pain points are, and then I can try to fix them. So that's I think that's it's sort of I would say a self it complements itself very well. So in terms of the open source stuff, because I'm constantly using them in my applications, I see what the problems are and I can fix them. And then I'm constantly motivated to add things to the frameworks and libraries because I need them to write applications that I'm using. So I'd say it's a very complementary situation that I'm in.
I love this. I love this. This really resonates with what I'm doing with my Hanami Mastery screencast when I'm just found a job that oscillates around Hanami, and then I have more time doing my work.
That's great.
But I have don't you develop it on your own? I mean, Roda, at least of how you talk about it, is seems like a one person framework. I mean, is there a team of managing that, or because the applications used by are used by California government, if I'm not mistaken, right? So
Yeah,
do you have
you're
a backup
correct.
team or something?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a small government agency. There's really just four IT people. It's me and one other programmer that's doing the programming. So I don't write as much of the plain application code that I used to. I used to do everything myself. Now, thankfully, a lot of the general like adding features to the web applications is done by someone else. I'm just overseeing it, but I certainly get feedback from the other programmer about like what works well, what doesn't. I'm able to use that feedback to improve things. Um, so I think that's one of the big advantages. But it's not like I have a huge team where there's not a huge team writing the applications, and there's also not a huge team writing the libraries and frameworks. Pretty much most of the libraries I maintain, I'm the sole maintainer of them. Now, I do get, thankfully, I get lots of nice patches, pull requests from the community. So as soon as I get those, I definitely consider them right away. I'm very good about looking at pull requests and issues and either merging them or going with a different approach or deciding I don't want to take them. It's not like the case where you would post something and it like sits there for months, which is common in other libraries. I mean, generally anything in my libraries, you're going to get feedback very quickly. Good or bad. I mean, it's going to happen. You're not going to need to wait.
Yeah.
But do
Well,
you?
this, yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Do you expect to evolve your team, add more people to maintain Roda, Rodaut, and SQL, so to reduce the risk of larger applications using it? I
Um,
mean, you are
yeah, I
perfect,
mean,
but
I don't have current plans to expand. Now, I think it's probably good. Obviously, you can't maintain one thing forever. But most of what I work on I mean, like especially like Rhoda and SQL, these are things that I didn't even design myself. Like SQL, I took over maintenance for, and Rhoda I forked from Cuba, but it basically still it's like taking over maintenance for. Both Rhoda and SQL, all actually every library, every gem I maintain. has 100% line and branch code coverage. It's designed very much so that someone could come in my absence and take over the project. It's specifically designed for that. Now, I haven't gone out and done that yet, but there is, I'd say, I wouldn't say I don't have plans right away, but certainly long term, I do have plans to expand the number of maintainers of my gems to reduce the risk. Because obviously, you know, with a bust factor of one, even if someone else could pick it up, it certainly adds risk to do that. Now, on the flip side, the more maintainers you have, the more complex development work becomes. Part of the reasons that is that you have to like communicate among all the maintainers, and get agreement. I work on other, Ruby itself and Rack, and I can tell you that having one mind in terms of, there's one person that makes all the decisions, which Ruby sort of has with Mats. Mats is like the person, like he makes the decisions. Like everyone else proposes something, anything with like major changes, he's the one approving it. So there's sort of in Ruby there is sort of one mind for that. I think that sort of like call it benevolent dictator for life model works much better. You want someone where there's one person making the decisions. You don't want something where there is a collective group of people making the decisions, because universally a collective group of people is worse than a single person in terms of making the decisions. But it is good to have other people that are, can step in the maintainer's absence, to keep things going forward, or until, someone to take it over, as the new benevolent dictator if something happens to the current one. I'd say that's where the risk is. But yeah, even when I add future maintainers, it's probably only going to be like one or two. I don't believe in, huge groups of maintainers, because then from what I've seen in other gems I've worked on, it often can cause more problems than it solves.
Yeah, and that's bureaucracy. Whole
Yeah, I mean,
process.
I work for the government. I'm very, very used
Yeah,
to bureaucracy, and I see what bureaucracy does, and I try to avoid bureaucracy as much as I can.
yeah. Okay, let's turn a bit towards content creation, which is the main topic of our podcast. Um, so a while ago, a couple of years ago, I started writing a book about Roda. Well, I started with the course, and then I showed it to you. You approved it, and then I went to convert it into a book, and then open source it. Today, you are the main maintainer of the book. The book should totally have your name, not mine, and
It's
I
probably
probably
about it's probably about 50-50 now in terms of the actual amount of content in the book. But yeah, it's
I'm not entirely sure. I took a read last year at the end of the year, and oh my god, it got bigger and bigger with time.
yeah,
Um,
I did add quite a bit to it.
yeah, and very interesting stuff, very advanced stuff. So I left it mostly at say beginner to intermediate topics, and then of course, you went through and added the more advanced topics, and you keep adding because I see commits coming and going. What's the process you're using for continuing that book?
So when I originally went through it and sort of did a full editing pass, went through it, saw a lot of things, things where the book was originally written very early in Rhoda's life, and then subsequent to that, we added a lot of features that would be good to discuss in the book, but weren't discussed because they weren't written at the time. So part of that was going through and adding those features, and then unfortunately, I haven't had that much time to work on it. And I'd say probably the last year or so. So most of the last year's commits have mostly just been people finding typos or small fixes in the book that I've been merging. Um, what I plan to do when I have more time, hopefully this year, is to go through more of Rhoda's again recent stuff since the last time I made like a full editing pass, and start adding things to different sections of the book where they would make sense. So often in Rhoda, new features are added via plugins, and then in the sections of the book where they would make sense, to discuss those plugins, why you would want to use them, the trade-offs inherent in using them, that sort of thing. So I haven't had time to do that yet, but hopefully later in this year I'll have more time to devote to that.
Excellent. Would you change anything of the process to write? because I think I left something like a process or an idea of how to proceed with the book, but I was never too explicit.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know, man. If you have any ideas, I'd certainly like to hear them. But I mean, mostly it'd just be, again, going through it, seeing recent features that have been added to Rhoda, and trying to, where it would make sense to incorporate those into the relevant parts of the book. Um,
right.
I think that's
We should
that's
get
that's the
together
main thing.
and talk about it
Definitely.
for a little while. Yeah. And my last question regarding this part, um, and feel free to not answer it because it's about money. At the beginning of the whole process, as I said, I started with a course and then a book, and I was selling it. And I offered you affiliate links and part of the gains of the book, and you rejected them. Uh, I know why, because you answered this question, but I would like it for you to explain the people why you don't accept that kind of money, because I think it's uh, I like your reasoning. I hope I could have contributed monetarily with the project, but yeah, you had a reasoning, so
So, one of the reasons is I would work on the book. It's sort of related to my job, and certainly it's something that I could give one of my staff members to help them understand Rhoda better. Um, it's a conflict of interest for me to do that sort of work and get paid for it. So I don't do paid work on open source anything during my work hours. It's a conflict of interest. It's taken very seriously in the government. They don't allow that. So, but working on stuff for free, to make things better, and especially if stuff we're using internally, that's fine. But it's not something I can accept payment for. Like, so when I was writing my Polish Ruby programming, the book I wrote, that was 100% done on weekends and nights. It was never done during work hours. That was I got approval to do things like that, but that has to be on nights and weekends. And a lot of what I worked on with mastering Roto was done during business hours. So for that reason, it wasn't possible for me to accept any sort of monetary gain from it.
excellent. Thank you for this. Seb, you have another question?
Well, not about this one, but about the Polish Ruby programming and the time management, because you already started to sneaking some information I'm interested in. I mean, I'm working full time right now, and producing content in regular manner is a challenge. And you are, I mean, yeah, how to name it? You're releasing sequel like once per month, and sometimes even often, and more often, and Roda as well, like once per month is the release or something like that. And this is astonishing, but the documentation related to that is just amazing. It's like a book in itself. Like I SQL seems to be so little library, so simple library, but when you go through the README and the documentation of it, all the features it provides, like everything is documented, and this is just perfect. I had never problem with having some feature that was not documented in SQL. I did not use Roda too much, so this is why I'm focusing on SQL. But this is pretty time consuming. I mean, or do you have any hack, or like how do you make it not so time consuming? And
Uh,
Sorry,
Fede would, I think
can I
Fede
add
would like
something
to add some.
before? Can I add something before you answer? I wrote the entire Roda book just using the documentation. So
not
that's
using the library
that's
itself, just the documentation.
yeah. I tried things, but most of the information I got was from the documentation. So that talks about how complete it is.
Yeah, so in terms of time, especially one of the things I try to do every time I do a major release of SQL, which if you are aware of SQL's development thing, there's one minor release per month, but major releases are very infrequent. And one of the things I try to do before every major release is do a full pass of the documentation, and that takes a long time. especially, I mean, SQL's a large library. I mean, it doesn't seem that large, but it is quite large, and there's a lot of documentation to go through. I don't know relative to the size of Polish reprogramming or mastering Rhoda what the size of SQL's documentation is, but there's a lot of documentation, and it takes a long time to go through. So yeah, if you're going to write that all out at once, it would take a long time. Now, SQL was around before I took over maintenance, and it's had 15 years of time to write the documentation. But just reading the documentation takes a long time, especially if you're going through and looking for things to edit or fix, or one of the big problems with documentation, keeping things up to date, is that you'll add features for one thing that could be useful to mention in the documentation, but it's hard to go through the documentation unless you're going through like a full edit pass and think about where would it make sense to mention these features that have been added in the last 5, 10 years. It's hard to do that without really going manually through the documentation with the knowledge of what's been added and seeing where it makes sense to mention things. So yeah, that does take a lot of work. It's one of the reasons I only do it during major, before major releases, is of the amount of work it would take to do that. I mean, it's probably at least a week of solid work to go through it, and then see what makes sense to add, change, make minor corrections, that sort of thing. So yeah, that is a huge amount of work.
Okay, so not really hacks, not really hacks.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet there. I mean, you really just have to read the documentation and have knowledge of what has been added since it was written, and then what it would make sense to include, which is obviously a judgment call. So it's something you need to have a detailed knowledge of the library and time to go through all the documentation, and it does take a long time.
Yeah, sit
Sure.
down and read and write. That's it.
But I will dig a little bit further, because you mentioned that your book had been written in evenings and weekends, which is kind of challenging. So my question would be, how do you maintain that? I mean, do you have like a family life, or you don't need to you don't need to answer for private questions, but it's just, this is about this podcast, like how successful people actually do it. I mean, because at the end you just see the final result, a book that has been published somehow. And it really bothers me how people are writing books in weekends.
Yeah, so I mean, I do have a family. I have a wife. I have a couple of kids. During the time I was writing the book, my wife was really good about, letting me focus on writing the book. I'd say Polish reprogramming, the majority of the content was written in about a month, basically detailed work every night and pretty much all day on the weekends for a solid month, going through and just writing a rough draft. Now, that took about 6 months of editing and polishing and things like that, but the content itself, the majority of it, was written in a month of a fever dream of sorts, you could say. Just hours every night, and then all day on the weekends for an entire month. And it was probably the hardest I've had to work, at least since I got out of school. So writing a book is it's very stressful. It's a huge time commitment. It doesn't pay very well, so you shouldn't do it for the money. One of the reasons I wrote Polish Reprogramming is I didn't have much else going on at the time. This was the middle of the pandemic. I also had some ideas that I sort of wanted to share. It would make sense to share them in a book. So I thought it was good, but yeah, I don't know that I'm still on the fence of like whether I would do it again or not. I know the publisher would very much like me to write additional books for them. They make the majority of the money, so I'm sure that's great for them. But for me, I don't know that I'm going to be doing it. It's possible there'll be a second edition of Polish Reprogramming in a few years, but it'll be more of an edit part of edition than like a new book part of edition. So it's just a lot of work, and it's not you don't do it for the money. So so I don't plan to be a professional writer. I do write a lot of documentation, but writing is actually not something I enjoy very much. So it's not likely I will do another entire new book.
And writing a book in a month, it sounds crazy, and I think it is crazy. It's a lot of work.
It's a
So
huge amount of work. Now, again, I had a long time. I mean, the rough draft was kind of rough, but I did have a lot of time to polish it and edit it, and work with technical reviewers, getting feedback from them, rewriting some parts of it. So it's not like the entire thing was done in a month, but the majority of the content was written in a month. But yeah, you're
right,
probably talking every week of that month. I was probably doing, say, I'd say at least 40 hours a week of book writing. So it's probably 160 to 200 hours just of writing the rough draft.
right. It is a lot.
And what about the research? I mean,
Well,
did you rely mostly on your experience, your knowledge, or you just because you paste some examples, some scripts that you need to prove they work, and some authors actually have some fancy automations to do it and so on. But how about you? How did you manage, for example, if your script is working with certain Ruby versions or not?
yeah, so the book focuses on Ruby 3. Now, I think most of the examples work in earlier versions of Ruby, but I don't think I tested them anything other than I think Ruby 3.0, which was the newest version at the time. Most of the book was written without much need of research. I mean, I'm an experienced Ruby programmer. A lot of the things I was talking about aren't really stuff you need to research. It's a lot of the book. A lot of the book, I'd say, is more opinion than fact. It's my recommendations about these are the trade-offs involved when you do these things. It's not like how does this work? How does this new library work? We'll have to research how it works. These are sort of just general Ruby things that I think as you become more experienced with programming, a lot of the stuff you pick up yourself. And a lot of it's, my opinions that some people may not even agree with. But it's really my advice for, these are the trade-offs involved when you're doing something, because I think one of the most important things about programming is to realize that everything you're doing in programming has trade-offs, and choosing the right trade-offs is what makes the difference between stuff that's easy to maintain or not. And again, sometimes maintenance isn't the most important thing. Sometimes you need to be fast, and again, that's a trade-off. Are you going to sacrifice performance for maintainability? So there's tons of decisions you're doing that all the time when you're doing programming, and it's important to recognize them and determine, am I making the appropriate trade-offs for what I'm doing? So a big part of parallel programming is sort of discussing those trade-offs, sort of so you can recognize them yourself and make the appropriate decisions for the application or library that you're working on.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we're approaching the last questions for us. How does a week, a work week, look for you?
So my job, I'm not just a programmer. I'm the IT manager at the department, so I sort of in charge of everything IT. One of the big things I've been working on, actually, most of last week was spent uh, testing upgrades from Microsoft Exchange 2013 to Microsoft Exchange 2019, which is a huge amount of work that I don't really like. But so most of my applications are actually written on OpenBSD, but most of like the clients and servers for the department are Windows, because all the clients are using Windows, are using Windows specific applications that only run on stuff that only runs on Windows. A lot of the servers are Windows because that's sort of how you maintain the Windows clients. You have Active Directory and all that sort of stuff. Not sort of my not sort of what I consider the fun part of my job, but that's it's stuff I have to do to make sure things are running. For the applications and stuff, those actually are all run on OpenBSD. So sort of in the Ruby community, I'm known for Ruby and SQL and Rhoda and stuff. But even before I was into Ruby, I was a systems administrator. And I was working in OpenBSD. So all of our stuff runs all of our Ruby applications run on OpenBSD and use like OpenBSD specific security features to lock them down. So if you've seen some of the presentations I've given in the past, I sort of discuss some of these ideas for, basically some of the approaches that we use to make our applications more secure. I mentioned that like performance isn't really a big deal. It's not like a lot of you work for a private company, you got to worry about performance a lot because you want to make sure things are, you expect, especially if you're working a startup, you expect a lot of growth. You need to make sure you plan for that. When you work for the government, that's not really as much of an issue, especially in my organization where there's not tons of traffic. Performance isn't really an issue, but security is a huge issue. I mean, security is like the most important thing. So that's one of the reasons we use OpenBSD is it's much more secure than other operating systems, and specifically allows features that you can use in your own applications to make them more secure by like locking down even what system calls are available and what parts of the file system are available. It's stuff that you can do in other operating systems like Linux, as like SE Linux and things like that. But unless you're like a kernel programmer, you can't really do that because you don't have the knowledge to do it well. Whereas OpenBSD's tools that it gives you are stuff that a mortal, normal application programmer can easily use to lock their systems down. So that's we've been using OpenBSD for 20 years successfully, both for our firewalls, our proxy servers, our web servers, things like that. And it's been that part I really like. So I really like Ruby. I really like OpenBSD. All the open source stuff I really like. It's the closed source part of my job that is not so much not one of my more fun parts. But
Oh,
I'd say in terms of my average work week, uh, in a good week, it's mostly open source stuff. In a bad week, it's mostly closed source stuff like Microsoft and things like that.
yeah. And how much time you dedicate to uh, developing applications versus all this other system
Well,
administration stuff?
again, a lot of it depends on workload. Like if there's a deadline and we have something, we have a new feature that we have to get out for some reason, then I'm, very much doing in like application mode, and I don't have a lot of time for the libraries. For in case situations when there's not a deadline or I have a lot more free time, I'm often spending much more of my time working on improving the libraries. So a lot of it ebbs and flows, in terms of how much time I can devote to it, because it is, it's not like the most important thing I do for my job. So it's something I generally do at my job when I don't have other things that are pressing needs that I need to do right away.
Thank you.
And you are working full time, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm full time, 40 hours a week, regular 9 to 5 job.
Super. Just normal nice guy who is a legend at the same time. Amazing. Thanks for all of that. This brings a lot of normality. I mean, it normalizes the image I pictured you for years, and this is really mind blowing. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, that's our questions. Is there anything else you want to plug or talk about?
No, not really. I mean, thank you very much for having me on here. I'm, glad that I could participate, and it's fun talking to you guys. So, if you don't have anything else, I got to go pick one of my kids up actually from school pretty soon. So,
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming to the show, for accepting the invitation and this amazing time. It was a blast, and I hope I will have a chance to talk to you once more at some point.
definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're always invited here.
Awesome. All right. Well, you guys
Bye.
have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.